During this series, we established that anarchy is the best method to achieving the greatest good for humankind, since it abolishes classes economically and politically, and therefore abolishes competition between individuals. We also established that applying this method is possible. Malatesta brings up what is, to me, one of the best arguments against anarchism. This argument acknowledges the fact that anarchism is probably the best method to achieving a thriving society, but it also says that it would be very hard, if not impossible, to make humans work together if they were brought up in a competitive environment. Bear with me for this long quote, but I really think it's important. We find ourselves in a world which has always been divided into oppressors and oppressed, and if the former are full of the spirit of domination and have all the vices of tyrants, the latter are broken by servility and have the even worse vices that result from slavery. The feeling of solidarity is far from being dominant in contemporary society. It is competition which presses on everybody, workers and masters alike, and makes every man into an enemy in the eyes of his neighbor. How will these men, brought up in a society based on class and individual conflict, ever be able to change themselves suddenly and become capable of living in a society in which everyone will do as he wishes and must do, and without outside coercion and through the force of his own will, seek the welfare of others? With what single-mindedness, with what common sense would you entrust the fate of the revolution and of mankind to an ignorant mob weakened by poverty, brainwashed by the priest, and which today will be blindly bloodthirsty, while tomorrow it will allow itself to be clumsily deceived by a rogue, or bow its head servilely under the heel of the first military dictator who dares to make himself master? So here, the argument recognizes the fact that an educated community brought up in cooperation wouldn't need a government, but it says that humans lacking education and brought up in a world based on competition, both side effects of capitalism, won't be able to adapt themselves to a completely different worldview. How could someone who grew up in a capitalist society, who got the minimum education required to work, and who sees his or her neighbor as someone he or she competes with, be fit to live in an anarchist society? Someone who advocates for the destruction of hierarchies might favor a democratic government which would gradually educate people to become independent and cooperative. Once that happens, then the government could disappear. This is an idea Marxists call the withering away of the state. It's the belief that once there is no more competition, the interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. But anarchists believe that the state can't wither away. Being a concentration of power, it will always seek to preserve itself, to defend its existence, to protect its privileges. On top of that, as stated earlier, the government doesn't add anything to the current forces of society. All that happens in the world is done by people. If you want to educate people, teach them how to cooperate and show them that cooperation is in their interest. You can do it without a government. The current forces of society, without being monopolized by the government, can organize an anarchist revolution because the government doesn't add anything to these forces. There are no reasons to lead a revolution through a government. Without a government, people will still influence each other. We don't need to force people to cooperate, we'll cooperate out of necessity. Abolishing the government won't mean we'll stop talking to each other and that we'll stop working together. We are mutually dependent. We will organize when the government is abolished, no matter how corrupted by capitalism we are, because the abolition of this mutual influence would be death. And when we vindicate the freedom of the masses, we are by no means suggesting the abolition of any of the natural influences that individuals or group of individuals exert on them. What we want is the abolition of influences which are artificial, privileged, legal, official. In Chapter 9, Malatesta gives examples as to how, after a revolution, people would still organize without a government. If people want to teach and spread knowledge, they'll become teachers. A government could not just create such people magically out of nowhere. The government would just force these teachers to do what they love in a strictly regulated method, a method that would most likely reinforce the power of the ones imposing it. A revolution wouldn't destroy the forces that already exist, but let them free to develop in the direction they want, free from domination. This would unlock an unknown potential that will most likely be very beneficial to society. And this is the only way that the masses can raise themselves, for it is only through freedom that one educates oneself to be free, just as it is only by working that one can learn to work. This is very similar to what Immanuel Kant once wrote. Freedom is the precondition for acquiring the maturity for freedom, not a gift to be granted when such maturity has been achieved. A revolutionary government doesn't only run the high risk of becoming as oppressive as the capitalists they're overthrowing, but it's also a terrible way for people to learn how to govern themselves. Actually governing yourself is the best way to learn how to do it. If you let someone else govern for you, you forget how to govern. On top of that comes the classic question of how would we decide what shape the revolutionary government would take? Well, it would definitely not be a dictatorship of either an individual, a group, or a party, because again, who would decide who this group should be? One can only impose him or herself as the ruler, and that is obviously unacceptable. But what if we elect the people that govern us? Let's imagine that they are, unlike the dictatorship, incorruptible. Well, first, Malatesta raises concern for minorities which, very likely, wouldn't have a voice. He also brings up the interesting point that some of the minorities that might not be listened to are also the most active, intelligent, and radical parts of society. But aside from that, if we decide that we need a government because the people aren't ready to govern themselves, then how can we say that these people are smart enough to decide who can govern? So no, a government is not desirable, nor is it necessary. To solve the problems plaguing society, there's only one solution: revolution. We need to identify the roots of these problems: private property, the people who own social wealth, and the government who protects them. We need to appropriate the social wealth and its sources and make it available to the community, for the community, therefore guaranteeing that the basic needs of all can be satisfied. We need to trade competition for cooperation, thereby eliminating any exploitation of individuals by others. Of course, there will be challenges, but those will be resolved in an anarchist way. We will discuss and determine what's best for everybody. And even if we are defeated, that we lose our fight for a revolutionary overthrow of the masters, our struggle wouldn't have been useless, because the more we act, the more we promote our ideas, the less property and the less government will there be. And if we consider that human progress is measured by how government power and private property are reduced, then we are pushing humanity in the right direction. And if today we fall without compromising, we can be sure of victory tomorrow.